So welcome to another episode of the IMF podcast. This is also a video podcast, which you can watch on the IMF YouTube channel and Spotify, because Spotify supports video. We'll be doing more video as platforms evolve, but for now, this is the audio version for those of you who still listen on the audio platforms. Today we're talking about geoeconomics, a bit of a comeback kid, and a topic that's very relevant in these times. We have the Atlantic Council's Josh Lipsky, who is the founding director of the GeoEconomics Center there, and Matteo Maggiori, a professor of finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and co-director of the Global Capital Allocation Project. Both have written articles for the geoeconomics-themed June edition of Finance and Development magazine. Check it out at imf.org/FND. Josh, Matteo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to have you both here. So rather than start with the standard what is geoeconomics question, I'd like to have you both describe these historical moments that you use in your respective pieces as examples of geoeconomics at work, in action, in very different circumstances. Josh in 2022 at a G7 meeting, and Matteo's dates back to 1945 with a study of Nazi Germany, interestingly enough. So Josh, maybe start with you. What happened at that meeting in 2022 that makes it a defining moment in terms of what we're talking about here today?
Well, thanks, Bruce, and really happy to be here. And I think it's especially fitting to be at the IMF, inside the IMF, talking about these issues, because as we'll discuss today, the IMF and the World Bank, in my mind, are quintessential geoeconomic institutions. And you mentioned they're comeback kids, and some of that's been forgotten over the years, and I think some of it's coming back with a vengeance. And certainly that was no more true in recent history than in 2022. So a little over 4 years ago, Russia had invaded Ukraine. There was debate across the G7 about how to react to it. There were emergency meetings, and there was a conversation about whether to go to what was considered one of the most extreme options, freezing or blocking Russian sovereign assets that were held abroad. Right. And there's about 300 billion that were held in Europe and a few other places, some in the US, some in Japan, but the majority of them in Europe. And the conversation happening in Washington in those days following the invasion was this would be a step too far. Brussels agreed with that assessment. This would send shockwaves around the global economy. Nothing like this had been done at that scale. There have been frozen assets before, certainly Iran is an example of that, but nothing the economy the size of Russia's at that volume. And on a Friday afternoon, there were meetings with the White House. They waved a lot of people off the idea that it was going to happen. And on a Saturday morning, it happened. And just to give you a sense of how quickly it came together, this major geoeconomic event, the Japanese had not signed on, not because they didn't agree, only because of time zone communication issues. And it was only a few hours later that we got Japan's signature on the joint G7 agreement to freeze Russia's sovereign assets. Why does it matter so much? Is because here you had what was considered a sort of understanding in global finance. We don't touch that. When it's a G20 country, when it's a country the size of Russia, they can hold their sovereign assets abroad. That's finance, and national security is not going to override the financial stability that we assign to the holding of these assets. But that was no longer true. And I think it was a watershed moment of saying, no, the things you believed before have changed. These things are fair game. And it was a signal not just to Russia, but around the world, that the way you think about money may be evolving as well. And the intersection of money, finance, national security had to be reconsidered by policymakers all around the world.
Wow. And so 4 years later, what do you think the chances are that Treasury officials are now invited to National Security Council meetings?
Well, there's still some issues to overcome within the U.S. government, as I noted in my piece, but it's certainly gotten a lot better than it was 4 years ago, and certainly better than my time in government, where Treasury was always fighting for a seat at the table. Now there's an understanding that if you're going to sanction an economy the size of Russia's, or you're going to try to sanction Iran, you need to understand macroeconomics. You need to understand finance. This is not solely national security. And there's debate about who should really win in that fight. Is it a national security concern or is it an economic concern? And that's a constant tension. But Treasury and the financial policymakers have a much stronger voice in the table. I think that's the right way to approach it.
And Matteo, what led you to choose this, this 1945 study on Nazi Germany to try and tell the story of today's, geoeconomic influence?
Well, Bruce, first of all, as you said, geoeconomics is a bit of a comeback kid. For people like me that grew up largely during the liberal order, there was a sense that this was done, that these issues were not going to surface again. And that sense was surely mistaken, as we've seen. I would say that the period that we've all experienced in the last 20 years is more the exception rather than the norm. And so if you want to go back in history and look at this, at least in the modern history, the study by Herbert Hirschman in 1944, it's really a landmark study. And this is also the period where your own institution, the IMF, is being set up at Bretton Woods. And Hirschman, first of all, is an incredible character. He was a German Jew, had escaped Nazi Germany to France, then went to southern France, northern France was being occupied by the Nazis, and actually helped a lot of prominent Jewish intellectuals escape to the US. He eventually escapes himself. He lands here in the Bay Area at Berkeley and writes a book on trade, thinking about national power and trade. And it's really a landmark study where we start thinking hard about how trade dependencies generate power imbalances, which of course today it's in the news all the time. You can think of China and the use of rare earths, you can think of semiconductor export controls from the US, or the US using the financial system, like the basic financial services Josh mentioned, sanctions. Those were about custody of the assets, but you can think of the payment system, the messaging system. So the fact that trade would generate dependencies and might generate choke points really first emerged in this landmark study from Hirschman, who talked clearly through the lenses of a trade model, and it's just a fantastic piece. So for us, a few years back, as we were revving up our own thinking about these issues, we went back to his studies, and it's just really incredible in 1944 how much of this he had already understood and put on the table. And I think I would argue that, at some point in the profession, we lost the plot on this, and we're now putting it back together. And there's lots of, pretty serious work going on right now, both in the policy institutions like the IMF and in academia on these issues, trying to get a better analytical framework to understand it. And it's incredibly policy relevant. But again, it's, in the big scheme of things, there's nothing new. I'm Italian, so we tend to go to the last time that we were truly relevant, which is the Medici Bank. But the business, the empire of the UK was pretty similar. This has been going for centuries, but right now it's coming back with a vengeance, I would say.
Yeah, and Hirschman makes an interesting point that we don't often hear, and that is that, while trade can be mutually beneficial, it's rarely symmetrical, and it's in that asymmetry where the trouble starts, right?
Absolutely. So he had what in my mind is a great view of a middle ground between being very dismissive of mercantilism, the idea that we're simply bargaining over a fixed amount of resources and we're simply determining who gets it. As an economist, we understand very well that the resources aren't fixed. As we exert power, we might make the world economy bigger and better, or we might destroy some value and make the pie smaller. But he also was dismissive of the notion that pure free trade was never going to generate power imbalances. And that's where the asymmetries come in. Today, we refer to them as like choke points. If I control a sector that has a big input to your economy, so I'm very dominant in that sector, it's very difficult to substitute away from me. The technological alternatives aren't very good, and that sector influences a large part of your economy. I would describe those three characteristics as being almost the definition of a choke point. And you can think of like financial services as, for example, something that the US controls that has that nature. The US is extremely dominant, particularly if you include its Western Europe allies. It's very, very difficult to transact away from that system. Again, Josh mentioned the Russia sanctions. That's a typical example where you're not going to quite collapse. There are alternatives, and in particular, other countries like China are building alternatives, but the alternatives so far are extremely poor compared to the dominant financial system control from the US. And it is a system that it's incredibly important for all parts of the economy. If you cannot process payments, particularly international, that's going to affect many other industries that isn't the financial industry per se. And those ideas with a lot more, added on and better theory really go back to the asymmetries highlighted by Hirschman.
And so, Josh, when I started producing this podcast many years ago, it's like more than 12 years ago now, we tried very hard to keep politics out of the discussion and focus very much on the economics. And I have to admit that I always found that difficult. But it's increasingly difficult to do, if not impossible to do, given that those, economics and politics are so tightly bound together now. And you write about, in your article, how many countries out there don't have the luxury of ever being able to afford to separate those two things. So what does that mean for developing and emerging markets, especially these days, given that the global economy is so politically charged?
Exactly. So one thing I say in the piece, Bruce, and I've said many times, is that if you go to developing and emerging markets, if you go to India, if you go to Brazil, if you go to Turkey, if you go to China, you don't have to explain what geoeconomics is. They live it every day. Yeah. They don't have to rediscover it. It has been part of their policy making for decades. If you think of industrial policies, if you think of subsidies, if you think of how they have to be worried about something that happens out of the U.S. politically, geopolitically, economically, and how that affects them. So this is how most countries around the world operate. The U.S. and Europe, the West, have had the luxury in the post-Cold War system, as Matteo said. This is the recent 20, 30 years period where we thought about it, but we didn't have to think about it all the time. We didn't have to integrate our national security and economic policymaking. So institutions like the IMF, when I was here as well, you could do the macroeconomics, and of course the geopolitics come into it, but not every day, not front and center. But the world has changed, and a series of events have caused that. We've had the pandemic, we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're now dealing with more protectionism around the world, and all of these things combined have led to the realization here in the US, and I think in Europe as well, that we have to not find a new model, but go back to the way business used to be done, and that's the way of geoeconomics. And it is neither good nor bad. It is just the way it is. And I think if you talk to most policymakers around the world, they would say, that's what we've been doing all this time.
So do you think that, developing and emerging markets have a bit of an edge on us in those terms, given that they've never let that go and they've been working at it, all this time?
Well, the challenges and the struggle for the United States and Europe as well, and Matteo got to this, is that what happens when you apply geoeconomics to the beating heart of the capitalist system, to the center of modern finance, to the global economy, to the world's reserve currency, the dollar. So this is geoeconomics done differently. If you do it in an emerging market, it's going to look different than if you do it in the United States. And I think that's what the U.S. is trying to grapple with right now. We understand we want to adopt this model in some ways, and it looks different depending on the political winds of the day. But how do we do it within our capitalist system, within our modern financial system, and not cause ruptures, not cause backlash, not cause economic hardship both at home and abroad? So it's true that there are things that the rest of the world may teach the U.S., but I think the U.S. has to discover its own modern geoeconomic model that's going to look different than anything that came before.
Matteo, you touched upon this a little earlier, but you talk about controlling the inputs to manufacturing and the financial sectors is really what makes countries so dominant. And your examples are the U.S. and China, and there are others out there. But you also suggest that anything less than full control of any given sector, like below 95%, is a danger for these countries, which in turn actually makes it very difficult for alternatives to break out. So how do you break that cycle?
That's an important question. What we put forward in our theories and also in the empirical measurement we've done is that power is very nonlinear. If you think about it, ultimately power is arising from the fact that I leave you with no alternative. So even having a little bit of an alternative is going to dilute my power over you a lot. So it's not about being 50-50 with the alternative. It's really like when I'm very, very dominant in a sector, that the alternatives become poor. And then, of course, that's taking as fixed whether the alternative technologically is there or not. It's just holding that fixed, being dominant is very important. That brings up at least two issues. The first one is that most trade isn't in that category. And so most trade doesn't generate a lot of dependency because it's relatively simple for many countries to find alternatives. So most sectors aren't strategic in the national interest. We shouldn't be overly scared. And I hope that we don't converge to a world where we move so much into autarky that in order to feel secure, that we give up on a large part of the big gains of welfare that come from globalization. On the other hand, you can't ignore that dependencies do exist in particular sectors and in particular countries, and that there are policies on both sides of the equation that can be put together. So let me start from the offensive side. If you're exerting power, well, if you're exerting power, two things sort of really come out as important. The first is your allies. Even a country the size of the United States or China, that are very large economies, they don't tend to be so dominant alone in many sectors. But if, for example, in finance you include Western Europe and a big chunk of the West, then the US does become very dominant financially. Or similarly in semiconductors, if you're thinking about Korea coming along with export controls imposed by the US. So forming coalitions and maintaining disciplines with your allies is quite important in that lens to maintain power. The second thing is restraint. So Josh mentioned these countries will have to figure out their own framework for applying geoeconomics. One thing that we point out is if you apply a lot of pressure and you apply it in seemingly random fashion, you're going to create big incentives for everybody else that fears being on the receiving end of this to move away from you. And so you're going to dilute your own power as everybody else fragments. And we're seeing some of that. I mean, every country is now instituting what are called anti-coercion policies, thinking about defending their economies from potentially unwanted exterior pressure. You want to limit that. Now, if you're on the receiving end of these policies, if you're a middle power or a small country, clearly they're thinking very hard about the dependencies that they do have and how to move away from them. And one of the things that we point out is, again, going to the nonlinearity of power, is that there are very, very few things that really generate big foreign power over you. You probably do want to address those with policies, which might be import restrictions, and it might be domestic subsidies, but there are very few. And so most things aren't of that nature. And I think in my mind it's quite important that we don't overreact and try to damage all trade when it really doesn't generate a lot of dependencies, but it does generate potentially large gains. So doing those policies appropriately, it's quite important, and also doing it in a coordinated fashion. I mean, you can think of, for example, Western Europe. We wouldn't want necessarily Italy, France, and Germany to do independent policy, not taking into account that their neighboring country is offering a lot of these industries. And so it's very helpful, for example, in that context, to do policy at the European Commission level. And more generally, I think worldwide, policy coordination is going to be quite important to avoid over-fragmenting the world economy. And I have some hope that the IMF will play its historical role in coordinating those policies, and I think that will leave everybody else better off.
Yeah, so maybe just sticking to that for a minute, restraint. You talk about how restraint can prove to be beneficial to these dominant countries, and how institutions like the one that we're sitting in today can help them reap those benefits. Talk to us a little about, how these dominant countries need not necessarily relinquish all of their influence to preserve it.
Absolutely. I mean, let me make a practical example. Let's suppose that Josh was the hegemon and I'm on the receiving end. Well, if Josh is so powerful and I am extremely scared ahead of time that he's going to bully me later in all sorts of directions, I might try to reshape my economy to be as little dependent on Josh as possible to limit its power. Now, that's going to destroy a lot of the gains from trade that the two of us might potentially have with each other, but it's going to make me feel very secure. Ultimately, the idea that I was scared of Josh leads Josh to have very little power because, in fact, I'm going to structure my economy to have little relationship with him. Suppose that Josh instead were to announce that he's going to stick to a set of rules. And it will allow some coercion when it's necessary. There are lots of reasons why coercion can be good. It can be a way to get, for example, public good provisions to occur. But he will limit himself, and he will make sure that I get enough surplus afterwards. Now I'm more relaxed. I'm going to trade with him. I understand that there's going to be a little bit of coercion, but overall, I'm much better off dealing with him, and he preserves some of his own power. So that's a trivial example of how a commitment that is unilateral, all he's doing is Josh is tying his hands, leaves him better off. And in our work, we really think of a lot of the global institutions that the U.S. set up immediately after the war as having a feature of this, of telling the world we're very dominant, but we want the economy to prosper, we want countries to be in our sphere of influence, and we understand that's going to potentially generate big asymmetries, but we will behave very responsibly in the way we exert that power. And this goes back, for example, here at Stanford, my colleague Kyle has worked on a WTO in exactly this fashion. And so I think there is a line of thought that goes back 20, 30 years on these issues that I think it would be good for the general public to hear again. I fear that one of the mistakes in the general conversation on these issues in the last 10 or 15 years has been characterizing all of these multilateral frameworks as being good for everybody else but the U.S. Well, in fact, I would argue that we're put forward with the support of the U.S. and quite good for the U.S. This is not, a general statement. There have been issues, things that we could improve, lots of things that are meaningful for reform. But I think at a broad level, I do think that restraint is quite important, and the lack of restraint can lead to a dilution of power. You have power in the short run because everybody else has built their economies thinking that this was not going to happen. But when you look over the medium run, you end up diluting your own power as everybody else is going to look for alternatives.
I think it's such a great point. I just want to add, sometimes we call this, from an Atlantic Council perspective, a doctrine of economic statecraft. Basically putting these guardrails around in some way, shape, or form that signal to other countries what are the rules we're going to abide by as the hegemon. And I think the difference is, and it's worth debating, and we can talk about it, is there's the theory of it, and then there's the practice. And in practice, countries can say, this is my doctrine, these are my guardrails, but when situations change, as we saw with Russia-Ukraine, the things you thought you couldn't do before you could. And this is the problem of giving assurances in the real world that's very messy.
So I read in your finance and development piece, you started off by saying that you were at a conference in Brazil and somebody came up with a very simple question and sort of in your ear saying, what is geoeconomics? So I'm going to ask you a very simple question here, given our discussion. What is economic statecraft?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I should say that, and Matteo may have his own view, there are a lot of different definitions of economic statecraft. So I'll give you mine and the Atlantic Council's view of economic statecraft. Geoeconomics, what we've just been talking about, the intersection of national security, finance, economic security, that's a broad framework to understand the world, how policymakers and finance and private sector operate in it. Economic statecraft, to me, are the tools of geoeconomics. Sanctions, export controls, tariffs, what we were just talking about. But there's another side of economic statecraft which doesn't get nearly as much attention as it should, and that's positive economic statecraft. Okay. That's what the IMF and the World Bank are set up to do, in my view. That's development lending. That's balance of payments. That's making sure countries stay stable economically. It is not coercion, it's the carrots, not the sticks. And the United States was part of the founding of a positive economic statecraft system, which is the Bretton Woods system. That's a positive economic statecraft system. It is not a coercive one. And I think the U.S. in the last decade has overly focused on the coercion tools, sanctions and otherwise, at the expense of the positive tools, which are actually the reason I think most countries want to be part of a Western-led financial system in the first place.
So, Matteo, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, first of all, I agree 100%. I think economic statecraft shouldn't be a synonym for negative inducements. There's plenty of positive inducements, and even some of the threats can be for good. I mean, think of, like, for example, safety at sea, or trying to get multilateral agreements done, or trying to build infrastructure in countries that might expropriate it. Having enforcement doesn't have to be negative. Going back to Hirschman, it doesn't have to shrink the pie. It can make the pie bigger, and then we have to think about how to divide it. I think it's a particular use of coercion that just leads the world economy to shrink. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I think a lot of the optimal policy design has to be to get these instruments to be instruments that make the world economy bigger and more prosperous.
And Josh, you talk about an event at your very own Atlantic Council with the Biden administration, where during a speech it became pretty evident that industrial policy was no longer a bad word. It was essentially framed in the name of national security. So when does, old-fashioned competition become geoeconomics, or at least embroiled in this geoeconomic debate? I mean, have we sort of given up on that idea of free and open markets?
No, I don't think we've given up on the idea of free and open markets. I don't think you can say that sitting in the IMF. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, things just come out of the walls.
Well, I just did.
Yeah, see. But I do think it's changing and evolving. And an example of that, that you gave, Bruce, was in 2021. So this was early on in the Biden administration. The director of the National Economic Council, Brian Deese, phoned us up. And he said, and his team said, I want to give a speech on the new industrial policy. And I had the reaction you described, having been at the IMF, which is, are we allowed to say that? Can you say industrial policy in the U.S.? I thought about it, in terms of Soviet planning and the way you think about industrial policies and some of China's policies. And he said, no, we have a new vision, and it's certainly not the vision of China and others. It's an American vision in a capitalist system, but it's about investing in sectors that are key to U.S. national security, be that semiconductors, be that green transition. And the idea was that you would send the government signal to the private sector to crowd in resources and put a priority where it was thought that private sector alone was not meeting the moment. And we could not wait any longer. And you see, by the way, bipartisan consensus on this issue in Washington. The U.S. now owns a 10% share of Intel. It's not something I thought I'd be able to say a few years ago. Yeah. Now, that does not mean the end of the capitalist system. That does not mean the end of the free market. This country believes in competition. But it does mean the government is going to be more interventionist in the private sector going forward, regardless of politics. And I think that is not a near-term change. One thing I talk a lot about with economists both here and around the world is, okay, we're going to go back. We're not going back. It may not look like it does today. It may evolve. It may look different in the future from the U.S. But the idea of the unfettered free market moment is not returning in the near future. And there will be more government intervention in the private sector. And that's not something I think the private sector has fully wrapped their heads around either. It's not a one-off from my perspective.
So AI plays into this, as it does everything. And Matteo, you've been working with large language models to try and decipher what the real impact is of all this sort of geoeconomic, at least geoeconomically influenced decision-making. What can we learn from LLMs, and how might policymakers benefit from that going forward?
That has been fun. So I'll tell you a little bit about that project. There were two things that in geoeconomics that we were interested in. The first is that, of course, a lot of the threats, a lot of the pressure doesn't get materialized in the data. If I tell, I'm the US and I'm telling a European bank not to do X, or they're going to get disconnected by the US financial system, they tend to comply because the threat is so powerful. Now, that's a well-understood problem, or a lot of the uncertainty might be about future threats. So you don't see them in the data. Similarly, what the asks are, whether it is, please don't buy this from Russia or don't sell this to China, it's very hard to systematically predict ex ante what the asks would be. So text is a rich source for this, particularly for public companies. CEOs, CFOs have to go and give regular updates to the investors. These are high-stakes settings, and investors ask questions. And so they might say, we know that you're not doing this in China. We would like to know why. At the same time, so this is a traditional source of text that has been heavily used in economics. At the same time, with AI and particularly with large language models, the ability to analyze this text at scale and really extract fairly sophisticated information. For example, who was making the threat? What was the ask? How did the company reply in many dimensions? Did it comply? Did it try to adjust? Did it try to find a way around? Extracting this systematically, it's something that, 5 years ago would have been very, very difficult at scale and pretty much in real time. You would have had to have a very large team of humans doing this. Now it is possible. And so we try to put together a project analyzing close to the universe of the public transcripts of firms worldwide, including Chinese firms. And what comes out is sort of fascinating. You see in real time how they're reacting to export controls. For example, in China, you see a big increase in domestic R&D trying to figure out alternatives to the things that they're losing access to, like NVIDIA semiconductors or the advanced lithography machines of ASML. When the U.S. puts tariffs, in particular when it threatens them for negotiation purposes, how are they reacting? The ability to do this in real time is sort of super interesting, both from academic perspective. So we use it to try to discipline our models, to try to provide empirical regularities. But I think it's also quite interesting for policymakers because very often the hard data comes out with a very long lag, while text comes out almost immediately. I don't think these things are substitutes. They're complements. They provide you a different view. I think of the policymakers' jobs very often is speaking to lots of people, having their antennas out, trying to figure out and piece together how the economy is reacting. If I think of, for example, the reaction to the tariff announcements on April 2nd, you're kind of immediately trying to figure out where inflation going to be, are the inputs going to get disrupted in the US? And this can be a big source of input into that is much more systematic than speaking to a few companies. So for those of you that are interested, the data, actually, we put it all online in a fairly friendly graphical interface. So if the audience is interested in experimenting with it, please do and send us feedback and questions.
Awesome. We will put a link in there in our blurb. So Matteo Maggiori is a professor of finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and Josh Lipsky, the Atlantic Council's founding director of the GeoEconomics Center. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Look for their respective articles in the geoeconomics-themed June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/FND. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.